Tonight on Nova, we continue a major series unlocking the mysteries of science in China. It's a tale of triumph, defeat, and the struggle to regain past glory. Journey deep inside these ancient walls in search of the genius that was China. This week, in the 19th century, Western powers dominated a weakened and divided China, while the Japanese raced to master European science and the technology of war. Their success created the threat from Japan.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
The waterfront at Shanghai, the famous Bund. Where Chinese families now promenade, Europeans once ruled, with Chinese second-class citizens in their own land. Shanghai was the greatest of the treaty ports, a western enclave tacked onto the margin of the ancient Chinese civilization. Shanghai in the late 19th century was wealthy, modern, cosmopolitan, but its tall buildings were symbols of European domination over the once proud Chinese empire. Throughout the 19th century, China was battered by the military and economic power built on Western science. Yet despite decades of effort, China remained unable to defend itself against the machines and men of the West. Not so the Japanese. By the middle of the 20th century, Japanese military might dominated the Far East. For centuries, cultural disciples of China, when the power of European technology confronted Asia a century before, the Japanese response to the threat was so successful that in the Second World War, the Japanese challenged not just China, but the Western nations as well. So what was the secret of Japan's ability to absorb the knowledge of the West? And what were the consequences of China's failure to bend to the winds of change? The story begins with the establishment of the treaty ports after the Opium War of 1839 to 42. In the Treaty of Nanjing, the Chinese agreed that the Europeans could establish trading bases in which Western laws, not Chinese, would rule. The first of the unequal treaties Asian powers were forced to accept. Beginning with the first 5 treaty ports, these Western-controlled cities formed a kind of necklace along the coast. And throughout the 19th century, the European powers sought to extend their influence from these footholds into China. Yet despite the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, Outside the treaty port areas, the vast Chinese interior remained apparently untouched by the foreign presence on the coast. But by the middle of the 19th century, the calm of rural China was to be broken. The West's opium, missionary activity, overpopulation, natural disasters all racked rural life, leading eventually to open revolt. This Chinese film recalls the most serious uprising, the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from the early 1850s to 1865. The Taiping Rebellion was based on a cloudy mixture of Christianity and some ancient Chinese doctrine. It was, however, a direct challenge to the power of the emperor and to the philosophy of Confucianism that sustained him. The revolution was led by Hung Shu-chuan, a failed scholar who had read a Western missionary pamphlet and in a vision concluded that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Hung and his followers dominated much of central China for over 10 years, and in the war to suppress his revolt, 20 million Chinese died. And though the imperial government did win in the end, it did so at a cost of weakening its own central power. Regional commanders like Li Hongjiang helped defeat the Taipings, and the experience of battle caused Li to become one of the leaders in the drive to adopt Western military technology. The Chinese began to buy some modern weaponry, though at first it was a rather haphazard effort. The British and French exploited China's weakness, attacking Chinese forts in 1856 and extracting new concessions from Beijing. In defeat, China's leaders divided into two opposing factions.
The conservatives in the Qing court said there was nothing wrong with Chinese civilization. All we needed was to strengthen our resolve, our faith in ourselves, our moral virtues, and that moral strength and spiritual strength will provide the answer to all these foreigners. We need a few more guns, but essentially it's our own confidence in our values that will save us. The reformers were a little bit more practical and said that the guns are actually more important than that. We still need the guns. Then we need to learn how to make them, to have properly trained technologists, trained by the Westerners to come and train a new generation of experts in military technology.
Li Hongjiang and other reformers in the provinces launched what was called the self-strengthening movement. Their efforts centered on developing military technology, and in Shanghai in 1868, they even built China's first steam-powered warship. But though the self-strengtheners continued to press for change, they were still imperial bureaucrats, and the change they sought was always constrained by the limits that the Chinese court would tolerate.
It was in that context that this Ti and Yung principle was brought in to try and find a way of putting in a nutshell what the problem was, that we will not destroy Chinese civilization. We'll use Chinese civilization as the essence. But we will simply adapt certain techniques in order to strengthen Chinese civilization without in any way affecting the heart of Chinese civilization. And then the Ti-Yung principle came in. Ti being the Chinese essence, cultural civilization as essence, and the Yung being the technology from the West, which could be applied for Chinese purposes in order to restore and strengthen Chinese civilization.
China's struggle to preserve its sovereignty was closely watched by Japan, still cloaked in isolation. In Japan, power lay in the hands of feudal lords, or daimyo. Japan's political system had been set in place by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who in 1603 unified the country and was declared shogun, or military dictator. The Tokugawas closed off Japan for 250 years, and the hereditary samurai warriors became the elite ruling class. But after the Opium War, the isolated power of both shogun and samurai were to be fundamentally challenged. In 1853, these black ships of the United States Navy, under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Tokyo Bay. Perry's orders were to negotiate a treaty with Japan, securing trade rights and establishing treaty ports. The Japanese, with the memory of China's collapse searingly fresh in their minds, saw no choice but to comply. Perry's face was a startling vision to Japan's woodblock artists, and the gifts he brought made quite an impression as well. Perry gave his Japanese hosts a miniature railway, new cannon, and this telegraph. As his official report noted, though in their later history a Pacific people, the Japanese are fond of military display and seem particularly desirous of scrutinizing all the warlike appointments which made their visitors so formidable. But well before Perry arrived on the scene, China's defeats had impressed some Japanese leaders with the need to learn from the West. This European-style factory was established in southern Japan by a remarkable daimyo named Nariakira. Nariakira sent emissaries overseas to purchase such novel devices as this carding machine for spinning cotton from Platt Brothers in the north of England. Nariakira imported engineers along with the machines to teach him how to manage the new technology. And this was all part of a much older Japanese tradition.
Since around the 6th century, Japanese leaders sent young scholars to China, which was regarded as the center of civilization at the time, and invited Chinese scholars and technicians to Japan to learn from them. So when Japanese leaders started learning from Western countries, they were not doing anything particularly new. In fact, in contrast to Chinese leaders who defined their land as the center of the universe, Japanese leaders consistently regarded their country as being peripheral to the center of civilization. And as a consequence, they were pretty much comfortable with the idea of importing Western technology and Western institutions to Japanese society.
Nariakira even designed a flag, the rising sun of Japan. Eventually, in 1868, pressure from southern daimyo and samurai led to revolution. The rebel forces rallied round the Meiji Emperor, transforming a powerless symbol into a Western-style constitutional monarch. The shogun's traditional troops were no match for rebel forces organized along Western lines. The shogun was forced to abdicate, and the hereditary power structure that had ruled Japan for centuries was swept aside. At treaty ports like Yokohama, the Japanese had begun to encounter the world economy, and the new Meiji government embarked on a road of radical reform and westernization. The Japanese, unified under the central control of the new regime, shared a common goal: to grasp the secrets of Western might in order to resist the further incursions of the West. By contrast, no such revolution swept through the Forbidden City. In China, more fragmented than ever after the Taiping Rebellion, conservatives and reformers remained at cross purposes. The reformers continued to adapt Western inventions to Chinese goals. They set up government-owned enterprises to funnel new technology into China. One of these was the Merchant Steam Navigation Company, created to handle trade on China's vast waterways. It was established with the support of Li Hongjiang, now one of the highest-ranking reformers among government officials. The reformers undertook several other projects: arsenals to build Western weapons, cotton mills, shipyards, paper mills, and coal mines. But the fate of the Steamship Navigation Company was typical of these experiments, as it soon fell afoul of the bureaucratic politics.
During the self-strengthening movement, people like Li Hongjiang were pretty imaginative about trying to adapt some of the modern techniques of trading and entrepreneurial efforts to China's needs. And the creation of a number of companies, one of the most famous, of course, is the Steam Navigation Company, I think illustrates how capable they were of using new techniques for their purposes. But the problem was that they had to do it in the context of opposition by conservative forces within the court. And therefore, they had to make concessions as to how these enterprises should be run. As the example of Steam Navigation Company shows, one can see why the traditional methods of interfering in the business, drawing out the capital, when in fact what should have been done was reinvesting the capital in further development, that part of it is a philosophical approach towards economics which hadn't penetrated in the minds of these Confucian bureaucrats who were managing. The merchants understood that, but they didn't have the last say in decision-making.
Some merchants grew very wealthy indeed, but unlike their Japanese counterparts, they could not dramatically alter the direction of the Chinese economy. Instead, the European firms of the treaty ports came to dominate China's industrial scene. Despite the self-strengthening effort, by the late 19th century, most of China's modern factories were in European hands. Even such traditional occupations as cotton and silk spinning were increasingly European-owned. The factories were a stronghold of unbridled capitalism, with miserable working conditions and the common use of child labor. Those Chinese in management positions had little contact with technology. They were primarily middlemen who organized resources and labor for the European owners of the factories. The Chinese were no longer masters of their own destiny. The failure of the Chinese to gain ownership of the tools of production created by the Industrial Revolution was to have devastating consequences. This blast furnace was one of the key inventions of the 19th century. In the 1850s, an Englishman named Henry Bessemer had introduced his new method for producing steel, in which hot air was blown through holes in the bottom of a giant furnace, producing the heat required to transform molten iron into steel. The process took only a fraction of the time and money required by traditional methods. Cheap steel had a revolutionary impact throughout the world. Railways and steamships connected the industrial marketplaces of Europe to the far-flung ends of colonial empires. The They opened up the vast resources of Russia in the east and of America's Wild West.
The railroad was particularly useful to imperialism because it allowed the Western powers to move into the interiors of the vast continents, into Asia, into Latin America, into Africa, into countries like India and Australia. Where before there had been merely trading posts, now there were plantations, there were mines and factories, owned and controlled by Westerners. And it was this that disturbed the existing power structures in those countries. So now we have China on the outer edge of all this, the receiving end, well aware of the commanding power of Western technology. And so, when in 1876, a group of commercial interests, headed by Jardine Matheson, a British firm, indeed erected an unauthorized railroad between Shanghai and Wusong, it did disturb local interests, and the local authorities were worried. The result of all this was that the Chinese government bought up the whole railway project. And now what did they do? Did they run that railway line? No. Lock, stock, and barrel, the whole thing was dismantled.
That railway was shipped in pieces to the remote island of Taiwan and then allowed to rust to bits. The Chinese resistance to such an obviously useful device seemed odd, even perverse to Europeans anxious to get on with their business. But from the Chinese perspective, it was the only prudent decision. The Chinese believed that the shape of the land itself has spiritual properties, and the railways both disturbed this natural balance of the land and upset traditional patterns of life. The Chinese also knew that if they allowed the British to build a railway, other European powers would demand similar rights. But the Chinese were unable to resist Western pressure for long. And when the railways began to spread, the lines were held in foreign hands.
Now in Japan, with a strong Meiji government, the political encroachment of the West has been far less than in China, and the railways proceeded very quickly. The first line was opened in 1872. It was a line between Tokyo and Yokohama. 20,000 spectators witnessed the emperor and his retinue boarding the train. Here was a symbol of the old Japan alighting onto the new Western technology. By the 1880s, most of the engineering work and the surveying done on the new lines was completely done by the Japanese. Japanese railroads were in the hands of the Japanese people.
This was no accident, as the Meiji government continued to press forward aggressively in its effort to learn from the West.